Well, I am, as you're going to see, am probably like the least technical person on the planet here as I try to wrangle my slides on, et cetera. But I have spent the last 6 years in a deep tech company, actually alongside Gareth here, called Hazy. Um, and I have, sorry, can you see my screen? Yeah. Oh, good. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So Hazy has been my day job the HPNA Academy is an academy I've had for a number of years on the side, and we'll kind of get on to more of that. But my point is just having been in a deep tech, very technical company for 6 years on the people side, but then just because of my background originally on finance and operations, yeah, I've grown to understand and I think appreciate what an unbelievably challenging role it is to be CTO of a business or frankly in any senior technical leadership role. And our topic today is about peak performance. I'd say actually rather than kind of peak performance, the kind of metric or way I'd like to think about that is actually sort of sustainable long-term performance. Unfortunately, it's, as we know, super easy to, burn out, super easy to perform at a high level, but not have it consistent. And it's that ability, which is probably as difficult as it is easy to burn out, to perform consistently at a high level. To me, that's really what performance was about. And Ben, to your point on that, in terms of our ability to deal with it, I totally agree. That's not a single blind spot that gets in the way. It's unfortunately it's a lot bigger than blind spot. I've been racking my brain this morning trying to think of a better metaphor, but it's like a blind, blanket or a blind blizzard of it. It's a very significant thing because around this whole area that we'll just refer to as self-management and care, there's just a complete absence of an operating system. There's an absence of a structure, and therefore our ability to systemically perform at a high level is just massively impaired by its absence. So unfortunately, it's much more significant than just a blind spot. And what I'd propose today is to first just talk a little bit about what that let's just call it a blind spot, that blind spot is, what it looks like, to then to have some time for Q&A on that if you'd like, and then to then talk about responses and potential responses to this and how we can begin to fill in those gaps. I'd like to leave you with a concept and a habit and a skill that I think are helpful in beginning to combat that. And kind of all of that's at the individual level. And then if time permits, we could talk about, how you implement that at the company level, and we could talk about what we've done at Hazy the last 6 years in that regard. Anyways, I think before we got cut off, that's the idea. What's the problem? What's the challenge? And at an individual level, and what is it, what can we do, or how can we think about it or apply it at a company level? So I think the thing that is not descriptive, but it's symptomatic of the problem is this thing, that they call the cobbler's kids have no shoes, which is very simply the tremendously high level of professionalism that we and high performing people, whatever their roles are, have at work, as compared to, relatively speaking, the very much lower and systemically amateur, if I can say that, around this area of self-management and care. And I first kind of was really engaged with this, I guess, in 2008, when you may remember the world blew up, had tremendous dislocation in the markets. I was working in finance then, but you're working on transactions with super high-powered lawyers on it, and then the next day, they're made redundant. Of course, there's nothing wrong with being made redundant and all, but for me, what I saw in that just time of upheaval was this gap between, again, how professional people were at work, and then when it came to a time that required resilience or that reflected sort of a need for systemic thought about that, you just had this tremendous absence. And when you started pulling on the thread of that, and I started in 2008 working with like junior equity law partners and others, on this, you started looking at it and you think about, well, if I had a work assignment And it was, for instance, like, buying a company. And you think about the standard of work that you do in that regard, the level of professionalism, the creativity, the thought, the completeness, the accountability in that, the supporting structures around the process and procedure for that, your ability and prompt and your necessity to process and articulate your thinking on that. It's just at an extremely high level. But when you then think about it by comparison to something in your own life where suddenly you're the client, and you look at something comparable, like, for instance, thinking about job change. Okay, well, I know everyone thinks about job change, and I know we all put time into it, et cetera. But when you literally just take those same standards that you're doing at work and applying it here in something when it relates to you, where honestly the stakes are much de facto are much higher, that this tremendous gap exists. And it is actually really a blind spot because we're all completely accustomed to it. And for reasons that honestly I don't understand, we're never taught how to build and how to perform at a level in this area of system of self-management and care, which is not about like the decision, do I take yoga, do I not take yoga, do I drink greens or not, right? It's a much more fundamental thing about kind of an operating system in that regard. And the absence of these things, I mean, there's no career ladder, there's no accountability, all of these things are just absent from it. And as a result, we suffer a huge amount. And the worst thing, B, is that we suffer in silence and sometimes, kind of profound ignorance of this. And our ability, as we started by talking about, to perform consistently at a high level is just massively impaired by this gap, or what's reflective of this gap. So just to talk about a couple of examples of this, if I can get right. So I've worked with people over 16 years, a lot of people, with their career planning and career thinking about it. And this is my hand-drawn, very non-scientific representation of the quality of strategic thinking and working that people do in relation to their job over time. And of course, when you're in between jobs, which is when the spike is here, of course, you're going to spend more time on your job and your thing. But this isn't about that. This is the amount of high level strategic thinking about where you want to steer the ship that is your career. And if you look at it, as again is very graphically and unscientifically shown here, but that it's massively clustered at this time where people are in between jobs. And if you just think about this and say, okay, well, what if this was not a person, but we're talking about a CEO of a company, and this is the strategic planning and amount of time and high quality thought that's got into it. And if you had a CEO who only put their time into that at a time of crisis, well, you'd be right in, wanting to say we need to make a switch. But yet, when it comes to us, like that's exactly what we do, if not much worse. And by the way, all of these things I'm not saying in a blame and shame way. I'm just going through and trying to shine a light on them. And there are things that we all suffer from, in different capacities. So one of these systemic failures here is this around, for instance, career planning. Another is here about having problems that fester. This is a representation of a common thing with people I work with, for instance, is doing your taxes, right? People don't seem to object to paying the taxes, but the process of preparing your personal tax returns over time, people very often draw out and they procrastinate and it sits and festers. And this again is meant to just be a simple representation, which actually does have some thought behind it, of over the course of a year of procrastinating on this key thing, like what is the cost, right? Each of these are like, times where you beat yourself up or you're bothered because you're procrastinating. There's a tremendous amount of fester. Again, by analogy, if you had a risk at work that was an open risk and you spent a year procrastinating and not doing it, like that's just would be unacceptable. But again, here in our own life, where we are the client, or we're not even thought of as the client, there's so many areas like this where we just allow ourselves to perform and suffer at a level. And there's no way of, or there's no easy way, and there's no mechanism for really thinking about this and saying, well, actually, if I weighed up, uh, the amount of conscious time, and if I took an estimate at the unconscious time, and I thought about the opportunity cost, this is huge. I mean, just as a rough thing, I estimated like 18 hours over the course of a year, one way or the other, on this, compared to what, taking 2 hours to actually fit it. But again, because it's in our personal life, because we have this kind of amateurism, and in this case, because doing what in our academy we call human maths, which is just an attempt to begin to quantify it, because we don't do that, we suffer significantly. So that's a second example. A third example is, we're a couple months now after the new year, but we all know what it's like for New Year's resolutions. You want to take something, yoga is an example, etc. So in the work I do and everything we're talking about, I never get into the question of, what people want to do. That's up to you to decide. I just look at it from a functional and from a how standpoint. And what I see year after year, and myself as well, by the way, just to be clear, is we'll have this random decision to go and pick something up, and it'll be well intentioned, and we'll go and we'll do it, and it won't stick most of the time. And as a result, if you kind of really think about that, like let's say the failure to get yoga going, it is kind of a triple negative. Number one, it's a negative because the benefit that you wanted to have of yoga, you don't get. Number two is you've set out, even if it's in a haphazard, half-assed way, you've set out, non-intentional type of way, you set out to do something and it's failed. And obviously failure is fine, etc. But the point is, like, it is that. And what you find very often, and why people tend to get quite depressed in Q1, is that every time you have an attempt like this that doesn't work, it erodes a little bit at your overall sense that I can kind of take care of myself and I can kind of get things in this sphere of my life done. So this isn't a point about yoga. It's not a point about, you got to try lots of things and you come up short, etc. But what it represents, at least in my opinion, is an absence of intentionality in like thinking about things in context. Again, I mean, if you just were thinking about this from a business standpoint, you just randomly went off without any forethought and started a new initiative, it just isn't going to happen, right? There's planning about it, there's thought about it. And if you are going to do it, we all put in structure to make sure that we can deliver it. But again, once again, in our own lives, we don't do this, or we rarely do this. A fourth element of the same kind of phenomenon is, I don't know if you're familiar with these opaque juice boxes. You can have it of wine or of apple juice, etc. The kind of phenomenon that goes with that is because it's opaque and because it's big, we just kind of naturally take and take and take from it without ever really thinking about the need to kind of be refilling it, because it's so big you can go for weeks or whatever without it. But then because it is opaque and you can't see the level that you've gotten to, all of a sudden you get to the bottom and there's nothing there. And you see people do this in regards to their self-care, right? Or your sleep, for instance. Like, it's very easy to keep depleting and depleting systematically your sleep and not really ever thinking about, systemically refilling it. I mean, we recover, right? You go, you sleep, but there's this opacity that and this kind of juice box phenomenon you see very frequently with people in relation to their self-care or the lack thereof, or just this kind of, as I say, this sort of like just amateur, thought that we can just take and take with not refilling. So these are just four examples or elements or sort of snapshots from the front, if you will, of what happens because we have this absence of accountability and structure in this part of our lives in self-management and self-care. And unfortunately, it's not mirrored at all by what we have in the workplace. And kind of in this area of self-management and care, I think of there being sort of like five areas that are kind of systemically lacking. So one, as we talked about, is structure. That's a response to trying to give people some structure to it. Second, it's very, very easy, obviously, to lose perspective and to be overwhelmed. Career clarity is something that is also lacking. I mean, exercise we do in our academy is to get people to think of their career as literally as a 60-year block of time, right? I mean, your job is not your career. That's a current deployment. It's not your career. And again, in the same way that from a performance standpoint, you want to think about things long term. So we do a lot of work about trying to help people to think longer term and more consistently and systematically, and avoid that chart that we saw before on career clarity. And the reason, sort of other obvious reasons why that's so important is that we've seen over the years that passivity is a very dangerous thing. It eats at people. It constrains bandwidth. And so, career clarity is not about changing jobs. It's about the type of strategic thinking that supports it and supports a set of, active decisions about it. So that's a third area that we find lacking in self-management and care. Performance, like we talked about, I mean, what could be easier than burning out? It's like burning out is like the inevitable consequence for a driven person without any guardrails. But more than that, a big thing we find in this area is an operative belief from people that you can't be driven and self-compassionate. So if you ask people that question, they say, oh, of course, logically. But when you start to think about it and examine it, for many, many of us, there actually is this operative belief that if you're going to be a super driven person and super ambitious, there's just an inevitable cost to pay. And part of that cost is you got to be super hard on yourself. Which is honestly completely false when you have a driven person. A driven person doesn't need to be kicked to be driven or to beat themselves up on it. And in fact, the lack of self-compassion is so significant that it's self-compassion that is what allows you to bounce back and to be resilient. And I guess just over the years, I found people, very driven people, just have this gag response to the word self-compassion because I think of it as excuse making, et cetera, which is not. So in our academy, we refer to it as Sierra Charlie, which is just NATO code for those words, but it's the tactical type. But this is an area, again, where without structure and without support, burning out, super negative self-talk, and a systemic absence of Sierra Charlie that allows you to bounce back is a problem. And that gets to the topic of our thing in general of self-care, which is similarly deprioritized and very focused on harsh self-talk. So, case I'm trying to make for you on all of this is that, to Ben's point, it's a blind spot, but it's a massive blind spot, and there's a systemic absence of structure and support that I don't understand honestly why that exists, but it definitely exists, and the cost of it is very significant. And if you spend your time, like I spend my time, primarily dealing with people one-on-one and over a long period of time, you see these things again and again and again, and it's just destroying a lot of value and destructive. So I've droned on for a while there. Before we go on to the next session, next part rather. Any thoughts or questions on that? Feel free to jump in if not.
I think from my perspective, I think our observation around, you spoke about the new year piece.
Mhm.
And I come from the delivery side, as you know, Carl, and the thing that's really important is consistency. Is that you have the regular at work. If you're doing this professionally, you would schedule the meetings, you would have a regular check-ins, you would look at where you are against your plan, and you would do that progressively. And it's less about the effort, it's more about the consistency. When you're doing it professionally. And I think certainly I'm at fault of coming up with a grand plan in the new year, and having it all planned out, but not managing the consistency and the check-ins to make sure that you're still on track, that you're delivering on expectations, that you're handling the time correctly. So that's what came out to me when you spoke about the new year. The observation is that if I were to be putting in a plan of change in business, one of the key pieces would be that those check-ins, the consistency, the regular updates, regular changes, and that is something I've observed in myself personally. I don't do as often as I should.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you. I think I will go on to talk about precisely that point, right? And I think that the good news about the blind spot, if I can put it that way, is that and that gap of the cobbler's kids is that actually by looking at our professional lives, looking at that professionalism, looking at the structures and what works there, learning to take that and apply that to help us here in this area. To me, like that's the macro spoiler alert, short answer, to that. And we're fortunate in that way to have that kind of exposure to these things and to be able to draw upon it. But to say as a general matter, we have this major gap here in this area of system management and care. And over the years, the people that I've learned to sort of draw inspiration from in this and really admire in terms of how they deal with a kind of analogous situation are the Dutch. And the Dutch, in relation to how they manage and deal with a systemic and existential challenge for themselves, which is that of, 1/3 of the country is below sea level, and they're in constant danger of that. And that is something that they have struggled with, I think, that at least since Roman times. But if you spend any time in or had any exposure to the Dutch and how they deal with it, it's unbelievably impressive. First of all, they deal with it at a systemic level, right? Not just a one-off thing, right? Like we would in self-care about saying, oh, let me solve this short-term thing. So the Dutch have a systemic approach. It's practical. There's no fanfare about it. It's about a lot of small pieces and small actions put together over a long period of time, all pointing in the same direction, which is how do we systemically manage this risk? How do we learn to live with it at the best? And then if we can further optimize on it, as the Dutch have done, if you look at this chart here on the right, how can we reclaim and expand space and I guess that's a bit of a cheesy saying, but not just survive, but sort of thrive. But these elements of a communal approach, of being very practical, being intentional, and being very consistent in it, to me, that is the type of response to a systemic thing that I feel like is required for this challenge that we have in our lives about system management and about addressing this blind spot. So what that looks like in our regard, as mentioned before, is really about bringing professional and operative capacity to it, drawing upon, as we'll talk about, our experience, but the structure and some of the metaphors that we have in our corporate, lives, and to learning to take that in. So just by sort of analogy to explain this. Every day you're going through and pursuing. The CEO has a different scope of work, literally a different perspective. And the CEO has, first and foremost, is like the chief professional officer. I know we have all kinds of different examples of CEOs, good and bad, et cetera. So taking sort of a generalized or quasi-idealized version of it. But the CEO has as a constant job, right? This professional management of the entity as a whole means purview and thinking consistently about things at the strategic level. Where are we heading the ship? Things at the tactical level. How are we navigating the current challenges? And things at the pastoral or sort of self-care level, looking after the assets, looking after the employees. That's a scope. That's the perspective and the job. And organizations are called organizations because they're organized. And as we know, someone's not just up there working randomly. There's a whole set of structure. There's a regular reporting cadence and structure that goes with that accompanies what it is to be the CEO of it. And in very simple terms, this, as I mentioned before, there's a skill, a concept, and a habit here. So the concept I'd like to just get to you is that the main way to close this blind spot and close that gap is by stepping into this role of CEO of yourself. People say, well, how can I do that and do what I do? As we're going to talk about, it's not something that takes a lot of time, actually. It takes a lot of discipline and structure, but it doesn't take a lot of time. And it's not an either or, right? It's a both. And that ability, which is just as a general skill of being able to step out of yourself, to me is just more generally is one of the most important skills we have in life, right? To step back and analyze a position from abroad. But here it's this ability to step out, in a regular, structured way out of the everyday, to sort of step into this role of CEO in a structured way. And the way in our academy that we, teach this and look to, put this in place as a way to do it is as follows. It's extremely hard to do this on your own. None of it, I have to say, is complicated, right? There's nothing, I feel, in anything we do in the academy otherwise that is complex, but it's hard, right? This core habit that we have people do, which is a very brief, lightweight, structured, personal meeting, is, as I'll talk about in a moment, on a weekly cadence. It's not hard to find 5 minutes. It's not hard to do a lot of things, but to learn over time to take that meeting as seriously as if it was a meeting with a third party, that's hard. And the way that we've learned over the years to teach that and to try and empower and equip people to step into this role of CEO of self is to teach things as a cohort. And this is kind of drawing, if you will, from the sort of the Dutch example about a communal response to it. So we teach over the foundation courses, actually over the period of a full year, cohorts of people together, teaching and training people in this core habit and in the things that sit on top of that, together with a degree of, as we'll talk about, sort of structural accountability. And that over time is there. I don't know if you ever had the frustration that I've had of, take a mindfulness course or you'll take a great course and it won't stick. And that is, at least I find, quite upsetting. I do beat myself up about that. But my argument to you is that this core habit of this check-in with yourself, this is way more important than any of those things, because the ability over time to have structured meetings with yourself where you have a cadence, and just like we borrow from that model of strategic, tactical, and pastoral. So in a very lightweight, structured way, but consistently, you're checking in on all three of those things, which means if you want to put in place something in relation to self-care, you're prompted to think about that every single week on the agenda. If you're putting something in on a monthly basis that you'd like to accomplish for the next period, you're managing it every week thereafter. Not in a heavy way, not in a way that takes hours, but in a lightweight, consistent way. And my hope, honestly, more than anything, is not just that you take up this practice, which I can teach you in a very simple way, but I really, truly, truly believe that it is a lifetime habit, because having the capacity to step back regularly and consistently over time to check in on these things, to me, that is the only answer to the structural absence that we have of any sort of support in this. When else are you going to have a consistent venue to think about your self-care, or to think about your career, or to observe how you're doing on things, if you don't have a structure and a context to do it? So this simple meeting, and it can be very simple, and I'll just go back on it, is this. If you want to take this away, and this is just to get going on it, you just start by scheduling it in advance, like it was a meeting. You got to force yourself to show up on time for it, which is hard. Just to get going on it, you don't have to worry about strategic, tactical, pastoral. Main thing is just to get in the habit of having this weekly meeting. You can just check in with yourself. You got to take notes on it. You got to keep those notes in one place. And then we have an accountability element of it that's very important. So for instance, like on the year-long course, if everyone, after they have their weekly meeting, we have a WhatsApp group where you just write the word done. So there's no shaming people if you don't do it, et cetera, something like that. But the power of doing things collectively is extremely strong, and that accountability thing, which is there. So my sort of not informal, but challenge to you is that if you want to take this up on a very basic level, I'd strongly encourage you to. And if you want to join any of the accountability groups and be part of a WhatsApp group that everyone else on a weekly basis is saying it's done, Carl at hpna.pro, and I'm happy to add you to those lists. So as I say, the structure that we have is a weekly, a monthly, and then a quarterly structure. And in the course of the year, we teach that as 3 months of classroom and 9 months of support in the field. And it's really only after a year, honestly, that you can get the habit embedded, that you can start to actually begin to really manage things and feel that there's a consistency of it, of a consistency of setting goals, monitoring them, reporting, and moving on in a very slow way. It just takes time to do it. Some of the things that you can start to do once you have regular meetings and regular structure is you can begin to plan over time for things, because you know that there's going to be a next meeting and a next meeting and a next meeting, and you can begin to just think, just again, in the simplest ways, like you would do at work, thinking about, what are areas, over the year, for instance, where I want to try and increase a positive thing, like investing in self-care, or what are times even more, I'd say, profound and widespread are opportunities to try and reduce the negatives in your life, like the minutes of fester that we talked about before, or incidences. Your ability to actually do that and to actually carry those things out without having a constant reporting structure, I mean, it's not zero, but boy, it's very, very, very low. And conversely, just the absence of having a basic structure and being prompted to professionalize, you'll find that the bar on these things is so low that just with a little bit of work, you can make very, very significant gains. Sorry, I just saw there's a note in chats. Fine. Okay, just to continue. So that's that. The point also is that once you have a basic structure in place, over the years, we've developed a whole bunch of tools that you could do. Tools for instance, assessing, a job change and a job possibility, not in a half-assed way, but in a really structured and thoughtful way, where your ability to systematically work to improve decision making or to think about your career. These are all tools and things that are out there. But again, when you step back and look at things across time, your ability to use these and to use them at the right time and in the right way and with efficacy in ways that follow is just massively, massively reduced unless you have this structure and this weekly, monthly cadence on it. It's like you can't have a train without train tracks, as it were. So some of the things, just as another example, you can start to do in terms of putting tooling in place is, we talk a lot about, everyone talks a lot about positive habits, etc. But if you think about it, usually what we do when we think about a habit is we think about a single habit. And again, the ability to systematically look at it or it's just impaired, right? It's one thing amongst the noise, etc. But if you really just think about it for a second, really what you would want to do is you want to look at your positive habits altogether. And the analogy, though, I got to tell you, I know nothing about vegetable gardens, but we think of as a vegetable garden, right? Where you have lots of different, vegetables and things growing. But the point is there's a perimeter around it. A vegetable garden is managed professionally as a whole. And so as an example, one of the really powerful things they have is this tool called the habit garden, which is this simple way of taking the positive habits that you have and looking at them in a visualization. Firstly, as you can see here, by frequency. Secondly, by the sort of health of it. So this bright green is a much stronger habit. And orange, for instance, is something that's withering. You can just look at this and look at it as a whole and manage it. And so we teach people to use this tool also on a weekly basis. And as a very brief, part of your check-ins, you're just updating this and putting it, against last week and looking at changes. The thing and the kind of that's really remarkable about all of this is that it actually does not take and require a lot of time. What it requires, as I said, is a lot of discipline to do it and to overcome a lot of inertia and other bad habits. But once you start to do it, you find there's just, it doesn't take a lot of time. So for instance, the normal weekly meetings in between monthly meetings, we don't let people do it for more than 5 minutes. And a monthly meeting is not more than 20 minutes. And a quarterly meeting is not more usually than an hour max. Because you don't need it the way we're approaching here. You've got a bunch of work or things you want to dig into. Fine. Well, that's separate, if you will, from this cadence. But getting it going and getting it up and running, is a very powerful thing. And I wish it was easier to do it individually, but it's really just found that to actually make and sustain substantive change, doing it as part of a cohort and together is just a much more powerful thing. So just on this, what are we kind of looking for kind of realistic sort of outcomes on these things? Well, I think in this area of self-management and care, there definitely is a lightweight lifetime core habit and a structure that you can have. And the challenge that says, oh, I don't have time or space for that, well, you can address that, period. You may think you could address it better or whatever, but you can definitely do it. And there's plenty of people that do it with the structure. In terms of the understandable challenge of losing perspective and always being the short-termism, again, that's a number of the key tools that we use are to prompt to people to think about things longer and to in longer perspective and to be connecting to them in that way. And as for career clarity, again, it's an ongoing activity, not 24/7. You're not doing it all the time, but continuing to do it, continuing to report and to process and things and to think it out. And particularly in the quarterly meetings that we have, we usually will do that with someone else who kind of plays the role of a non-exec director, if you will, to your CEO. So usually, like, I would play that, but you could get someone else to do it. In that process of thinking and planning and then having to articulate it to a person, you just find your thinking and your work is just rises to a level that's much, much closer to what you have at work. And so it is possible to systemically gain much greater clarity on your career. Again, our system is an operating system. It's about the how. It's not about the specifics. You've got to do that, but systemically to have that, you can definitely improve. Similarly, on importance, performance is definitely levels of improved effectiveness and resilience you can get. And lastly, kind of to our original topic, it goes without saying, of course, that you can't perform at any kind of a sustainable level, at any kind of a peak level, without systemically and thoroughly and professionally looking after your self-care. And that's why self-care is on the agenda of every single meeting that you have every single week. It's not a thing you do in times of crisis. It's not a thing you do when it's times of convenient. It's a basic core activity that's there. And again, I think you can learn in this area of Sierra Charlie that actually you can be driven and have Sierra Charlie. And actually that Sierra Charlie is a key thing on your resilience. So again, the bar, good news and bad news, I suppose you could say, is the bar is very low in this area because we just all do perform at a very amateur, unstructured level. So just with a little bit of work and a little bit of structure, you can have quite significant gains. Again, not magical, your life is going to change overnight, but like Dutch water gains, i.e. learning to systematically push back things, etc. You can do quite a bit. So that's a bit about the approach and the kind of response to this blind spot that we have that does so profoundly and significantly get in the way of our peak performance, and which does honestly really sort of threaten us in a lot of ways. And that's a sort of it on the individual level. Can talk a bit about it as it relates to putting it into a company, but just I don't know if any questions or any thoughts on that before we go on. No? Okay, terrific. So that's at the individual level. What and Gareth, knows this. What we've done at a company level is that you do things kind of in two ways. In Hazy's, where we've been the last 6 years, fantastic deep tech company, fantastic CEO, truly, who's there, for whom all of this is very important and was super supportive of it. But what you can do at a company level is really two things. Firstly, is to find ways and structures for working with people as individuals about it and improving this area. And then secondly, what you can do and what we've done at Hazy is we've added in an important institutional element into it, which we call the pastoral function, which are, in our case, biweekly 30-minute meetings with everyone, one to one. And the topic of that is the person themselves. It's separate from a dialogue with a line manager. It's separate from the others. So in Hazy's instance, like I did it myself with people. But what it is it's time for people to think, to process, to build. And it's the kind of equivalent, if you will, of the weekly cadence that we have as individuals. Here was a biweekly cadence where people knew that you're going to have consistency of meeting. You're going to have consistency of narrative, consistency of a time of being prompted to think about self-care and to think about these things. And that it's systemic and it's the person first, and really just recognizing that there's no more complicated entity than the human being. When you're asking people in Hazy and your other organizations to consistently perform at a high level, people need support in doing it. They need outlets and they need professionalization. So that's something that we, Harry, our CEO, and I put in place 6 years ago and made it an important feature. And I think gotten good results out of that, not just in terms of retention and these other things, but also just the number of times that because you're close to people, because you're focused on people, and because you're getting people to think about and be prompted to professionalize their own self-care, many instances of burnout over the years we've been able to address early. I think people have learned over time to systematically take much better care of themselves and have performed, at a high level as a result. So obviously things like this are specific to each organization, et cetera, but certainly the experience we had putting that in place, Hazy was quite successful. So Hazy, you can go and see itself at hazy.com. If this field or this area of professionalizing self-care and learning to become the CEO of yourself and trying to learn how to systematically move the needle on these things, if those are of interest, please do reach out to me, Carl at HPNA .pro. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Carl.
Thanks, man. So any other questions or anything else, feel free to reach out anytime.
Cheers. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care.